I'm so delighted to introduce Bill Meridian. Bill holds a Bachelor of Science and MBA degrees from New York University and has worked on the stock market since 1966. He began to study astrology in 1972. He has been twice ranked Market Timer of the Year by Timer Digest. Bill was advisor to the legendary Wall Street trader Frankie Joe for 12 years. He trained to be a core energetic therapist with Dr. John Pierkos in New York for 9 years. He studied Zen at Wellspring Monastery. His interpretive work is a combination of his training in core energetics and Zen practice. His 4 books are Planetary Stock Trading, Planetary Economic Forecasting, Predictive Power of Eclipse Paths, and Mastering Geopolitical Prediction. He currently runs an investment business from his homes in Vienna and the United States. Bill is a member of the board of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and his website is billmeridian.com. So please put any questions in the Q&A. The chat is just for discussions, and we're so excited to have Bill talk to us about the what do you call it? The monetary stuff, the financial forecast for 2025. Welcome, Bill.
Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you everyone for your attendance today. Okay, am I on now?
You are good to go. We could hear you.
You just disappeared, so I have to share screen. And I have to get I've got to clear all these little thingies here. Okay, this is the 2025 economy and markets, obviously. And business activity is likely to accelerate in the second half of 2025. By business activity, I'll explain that in a minute. That means the economy. And the stock market will likely rise with an August-October correction, actually also February, March, I think, which I'll explain further on. Now, this book I wrote, I don't remember when, in the early 90s, and it was written with, I wrote it about 30 years ago. I was trying to discover which planetary cycles and phenomena have the greatest effect on the U.S. economy. The data was obtained in the 1980s from Ameritrust Bank. It was done on 2 levels. Now, let me just explain the data for a minute. Ameritrust went all the way back to 1790, and they took any scrap of economic data they could find. At one point, it's pig iron prices, because you couldn't make anything in that economy without pig iron. So a high pig iron price was considered to be great economic activity. And they took everything and they stitched it all together to create a business activity index that began in 1790 and ended in 1988. The reason that it ended was because somebody took over the bank. And of course, the first thing you do when you take over any organization is you fire all the creative people who are doing all the new stuff and replace them with dunderheads. So I started keeping the data up myself. Today, the data is the FRB index of industrial production, which is reported by the Federal Reserve Board. It's supposed to be a measure of industrial activity, and it's fed into a regression analysis to keep the curve going. And so the first study was quantitative, comparing sidereal and synodic cycles to a monthly index of industrial production, which I just explained. Thus, the reader is able to determine the influence that Jupiter and Saturn or any other planets have on production at any point in their synodic cycle or in any degree of the zodiac as the planet transits. The second was qualitative. Charts showing the chronological placement of crises relative to synodic and sidereal cycles were constructed. In other words, you can look at the chart and go to Jupiter-Saturn 180 and just run your eye down vertically, and you can see every crisis or not crisis, something wonderful that occurred at the 180, which you can do with transiting through the signs. And I still remember doing that in the early 90s and having to snip out all these little things and put them on a big 11 by 17 graph. And then I would find them stuck on my sleeve or they fell on the floor, something I'd like to forget. I was so glad when the book was done. So, for example, one can scan down a graph showing Saturn 270 to Neptune and so on and so forth. So now the 6 most accurate cycles, in other words, this was done by determining what percent of the change in the index was described by the planets. And the index itself, it's an oscillator. I should have made a copy of it. It's an oscillator that it's a straight line with a black oscillator going like that. And the straight line represents average economic growth, which is about 3% a year. So in other words, if it gets way up above that line and then crashes below it, it's going from a high level of activity to a low level. By far and away, the winner was Jupiter through the signs. That is, you can forget about 2 through 6. Jupiter through the signs is about 50% of the strength. Neptune node was second. Don't ask me why. I don't know. Pluto node was third. Saturn Pluto was fourth. Saturn through the signs was fifth. And Saturn Neptune was sixth. Now, let me just say, Saturn Neptune is a very vital cycle. It was Muriel Hasbrook and Harriet Higginson, 2 names from the distant past. That well, Harriet was a trip. She was a real firebrand, and Charles Jane told me she was making $35,000 a year in the 1930s when nobody had any money by trading stocks. And I met her only once, but this is a cycle that she used, and it's a cycle of debt. And in the 2007-2008 real estate crisis, not only did you have a peak in the real estate cycle, but you had a key point in the Saturn-Neptune cycle, which meant that people were not willing to take on more debt, which is Neptunian. They just like people like chocolate and vanilla, and then they want to wear brown and black. People take on debt, and they feel like they don't want to take on debt. So that Saturn-Neptune cycle is deflationary, as you might imagine, and also some work I did with Sergei Tarasov showed it also creates droughts. And Saturn-Pluto is very prevalent when, well, in your own chart, when you have excessive debt and you decide to clean out the house, clean out the clutter, but also get rid of the debt. It also works in horoscopes of incorporation where they decide to lay people off, cut expenses, and things like that. Where Neptune node and Pluto node come from, I don't know. Saturn through the signs, I think, is very logical, as is Jupiter through the signs. But the Jupiter-Saturn cycle did not show up as significant only at the conjunction and the opposition. In between, it really contributed nothing to predicting economic activity. So this is the Jupiter through the signs. That's an original graph on an old line printer that was done from the Astroanalyst program which I worked on with Rob Hand. And obviously the cycle length, as you know, it's 12 years. We have 11.9 here, and that's 18 cycles. So in other words, economic activity, these are done as oscillators. It begins at 1,000, it ends at 1,000. We do that intentionally. So in other words, economic activity tends to grow up until Jupiter enters Leo. Then it has historically slid down until it got into Virgo. And then it was somewhat flat, but then rose again up into Capricorn. So note, that's the Capricorn cycle, the Saturn through the cycle, through the signs. I mean, that's logical to have Capricorn being some sort of a turning point. And it tends to bottom in Aquarius, and then from Aquarius, it rises through Pisces and goes back up to a peak at Leo. So right now, obviously, we're in Gemini, so it's not really having much of an effect right now. But that's the main man's done in an old line printer. This is back in the ancient days. Young people probably will not remember steam-powered computers that we used to work with. And this is the cycle composite. Now, this is the addition of these 6 cycles. Jupiter signs, Neptune node, Pluto node, Saturn, Pluto, Saturn signs, Saturn, Neptune. That line is this line is the addition. And that was the actual index up until that point. Now, I put all this stuff in later. Had I known how well this was going to work, I would have made more publicity with it, but I didn't know. This is the 2007, 2008 real estate bust. And then we had stagflation, then the 2016 boom. Well, that real estate bust That occurred at a key point in the Saturn-Neptune cycle, which has to do with debt. In order to buy real estate, or if you're speculating, you need a mortgage, you need debt. Well, suddenly, at some point in the Saturn-Neptune cycle, people say, I've had enough debt, I'm not going to take on anymore. And that, of course, does not contribute to an upward move in real estate. On top of that, as many probably know, there's an 18-year real estate cycle that is amply described in the book, The Secret History of Real Estate and Banking, by my friend up in London, whose name I always forget, so I'm going to get you the name because I don't want to forget it this time. Oh, Philip J. Anderson. And there's a very, very regular cycle going back hundreds of years, starting in England, of the way it works. You have a 4-year crisis, then 7 years of gradually rising real estate. Then suddenly, I guess people get confident after 7 years, and then it goes straight up for 7 years. In other words, people start paying outrageous prices for houses. So it's 4, 7, and 7, total is 18. So we hit the top in that cycle back here. So it was, number one, a top in real estate, a top in business activity. Number two, a key point in the Saturn-Neptune cycle. And number three, it was a peak in the real estate cycle. So if you add 4 years, you get what, 2011, 2012, that's the crisis period. The place I have in New Jersey that I just left on Thursday, I bought that in 2012. It is now worth 4 times what I paid for it. It was so depressed, it was ridiculous. I was thinking of buying some other units just as speculation purposes, but I didn't do it. So that was not really in here. This was not just this cycle. There was also Saturn, Neptune to peak in the real estate. So it was 3. And then you have the 4 years down, and then 7 years, it starts rising again. That probably started around 2004 plus 2, so 2018 or so, 2016. This was the rising 7-year period. So it's 7 years of gradually rising prices, 4 years down, 7 years of gradually rising prices, and then 7 years of accelerated rise in the prices. So if you are thinking that's 2023, 2024, you're correct. We're at a peak in that cycle again. Whether it's related to the North Node of the Moon, or I don't know, it's just a straight number count. Now in here, as you know, in this business, you always have to have something to say. I mean, just turn on any business news, they're always yakking. They're not saying very much, but I'm in London, you know, around a big, you know, these wooden tables, you know, in the library, you know, the brandy snifters, and thank heaven there were no cigars or pipes. And these grizzled, one of these, you know, old refined, you know, British gentlemen with all white hair, whom you can learn a ton from, says, young man, as I understand this cycle, but why should we have 8 years of flat growth? And, you know, of course, the answer from astrology is because the 6 cycles are netting out to about 0. See this 100.4? Look at this, they go down to 97, is that? So they're, in other words, they're negating. As one cycle turns up, the other one turns down. So thinking on my feet, I said, well, they'll probably elect a Democrat who's not friendly to business, and you'll have 8 years of flat growth. And then they'll elect some Reagan-type, more conservative guy in 2016 who will set off another boom. And it turned out that's the way I was basing on this cycle, but I had to fill in, you know, you have to throw a lot of words out. And so the 2016 boom was obviously, you know, this is when Trump got elected, real estate confidence started to return. And so real estate started shooting up in price, as you all know, especially in California. So now this is the cycle projection for 2024. So it hit a very good peak up here, that's 3.4% above trend. And you'll notice it came down. So it's really pretty elevated. And the fact that it comes down is not a real big deal. It's coming down from a very high level. But now look at this, it bottoms here in June. Well, we just elected a new, more business-friendly administration. And so this is saying you've got 6 months of weakness, but then the economy is going to start accelerating according to the cycle. And again, most of that is Jupiter through the signs. Jupiter will go from Gemini to Cancer. It's not getting to the depressing sign of Leo that depresses economic activity. So let's look to the stock market. And, I bought my first stock in 1966. I was 17. And of course, you learn, as someone once said, it's very true, learning about the stock market is like going into a room and there's no light, and you turn to your right and you whack your head, and something that whacks your head is to your right, and you go to the left and you crack your toe into something else. And after you've been all through the room, you know what the stock market is like, but it's like being in a dark room. September has been the weakest month that should be in any year. That's the seasonal cycle. June has been the second weakest month. This is going back to 1885 on the Dow Jones Industrials. October has been the most volatile month, has seen the largest one-day drops, but has usually closed, it should be on the upside. December has been the strongest month, which is the one we're in. The average high in any year is September 5th, and the average low in any year is October 27th. Now, I was in the old NYU library, and I picked up a book that was covered in dust. It was from the Manchester University, the Journal of Statistics, and there was a study done of reserves at the Bank of England from 1840 to 1890, and reserves at the Bank of England tended to hit a low every October. And the author wrote, well, this is obviously that we're an agrarian society. Well, it's not agrarian anymore, and October is still the same type of month. There's something very much going on there. So this is from 1885, this is 138 years. That's the expected return. In other words, if there's a 100% chance of the market going up 0.77%, you multiply the likelihood it's going to be up by the amount that is usually up, and you get that level. Here, obviously, February is quite flat, and you see the summer rally, and then you see how weak September is, and then you see this rally. This has stayed more or less the same. It was my old pal Arthur Merrill who wrote the book about seasonal cycles. It's Behavior of Prices on Wall Street by Arthur Merrill. And this is the Dow Jones. Only in post-election years, you'll notice the number of years now drops to 34. Now you see February right there. I remember being very struck when I first opened Arthur's book in the late 60s. February is the single weakest month in the election cycle. In other words, you've got 48 months. You got the election year, 1 year after, 2 years after, 3 years after. 1 year after February in the post-election year is the single weakest month. So the overall tendency is to be down in the month of February, which is coming up, which is why I think there'll be a high in January. And then you get 3 strong months. Then you get the usual of June. August is much weaker than it usually is, but December is usually always strong. So something else I have to explain, again, from Ameritrust Bank, Edgar Lawrence Smith, back in the 30s, broke down stock market and economic activity by the decennial pattern. Years ending in 0 have the worst returns. Bull markets usually start in years ending in 2. They usually end in years ending in 0. Years ending in 5, which we're going into, are usually the strongest. And there's never been, I think there's only been 1 year ending in a 7 in which there has not been a crisis. So, of course, if you say this to people that I have to deal with, they'll look at you like you're crazy. They want to know why it works out. And it's like, the old parable of the goose that laid the golden egg. So now here's the Dow in years ending in 5 that are also post-election years. Now the sample's down to 6. But you can see February is weak in post-election years, but February, March, I think there'll be a correction in here. And I also think there'll be a correction over here, August into that month. Let me just skip ahead. Okay, now I know what I'm doing. So the 1 year cycle is the annual seasonal cycle. You can go to the Financial Analyst Journal, which is where all the PhDs write, and they call it seasonal attention disorder, or SAD, S-A-D. They can't explain it. They just note that it's real. The 4 year cycle is called the election year cycle and is attributed to the Fed juicing up the economy before the election to favor the incumbent. The only problem with this, well, the year prior to the election is the strongest, the election year is second, the year after the election is the worst, which is the coming year. But the cycle existed prior to the origin of the Fed in 1913, and it exists in countries where there's a 4 year election cycle, 6 year elections, or no elections whatsoever. There's a 4 year cycle. The 1 year cycle, that should be 10 year cycle, is also called the decennial pattern developed by Edgar Lawrence Smith, which I just explained. So Some Wall Street veterans contend that the Rothschilds were the first to discover the use of the cycle for profitable trading. This is the Fourier cycle. Earlier in the last century, a New York investment group reportedly employed a mathematician to uncover the Rothschild secret. More recently, 1952, Beryl L. Dunbar wrote about a 3.8 Fourier cycle in the June 30th, 1952 issue of Barron's. And I discovered when we were working on AstroAnalyst, Mars Vesta complete one synodic cycle in 3.90 years, not too far from 3.84 years of Beryl Dunbar. So I think Mars Vesta describes the Fourier cycle better than anything. And I'll never forget studying asteroids with Eleanor Bach in New York. And she said, Vesta rules investments. It represents security. Frankie Joe was one of the greatest traders in the history of Wall Street. He was a Chinese orphan, had no money, got a job working on the floor of the exchange, went to this Wall Street veteran, Al Rosen, and said, I want to make a lot of money. Frankie, you got to save your money. So he saved up $600 and he started an investment newsletter, which failed. He then started trading. In 15 years, without having a losing year, he made for himself in interstate securities $32 million, and some years being up 200 to 500%. He was on the cover of Barron's twice in the early 80s. He died at a very early age. He was born with Jupiter trine Vesta. So he was a master of paper securities, bonds, stocks. So I use the Mars Vesta cycle, which you can, it's at billmeridian.com under articles, is a whole study. You buy when Mars and Vesta are 240 degrees apart and sell them when the pair are 90 degrees apart. That doesn't give a sell signal for a while. What will give a sell signal this coming August. Mars through the signs versus the Dow. This is the same as Jupiter through the signs, except it's 1.8 years instead of 11.9 years. And I've drawn in all the signs here. And it shows that the stock market, let's put it this way, the Mars through the sign cycles contributes to the upward movement of the market from Taurus, Gemini, up through Libra. When it hits 0 Libra, it contributes to the downside. If you rely on this cycle alone, you're not going to do well, because I already tried this way back in the late 90s or early 90s. But I found this. When this cycle tops, when the annual cycle tops when? In the summer. And in other words, if Mars hits 0 Libra in the summer, your odds of a lower stock market are greatly magnified, because not only is the 1-year annual cycle pointing down, but this 1.8-year cycle, they're both pointing down. 2016, I was Timer of the Year in Timer Digest because it was summer, so the solar cycle was peaking. Everybody knows that. But I had this 1.8-year cycle peaking. And not only that, when Mars is 180 degrees to Uranus, if we had that chart up on the screen right now, the peak is right at the opposition. In other words, it bottoms around the conjunction, rallies up to the opposition, then declines. So annual cycle topping, Mars, the sign cycle topping, Mars, Uranus. I caught that decline and I caught the low. None of the other guys, there are 170 services that were tracked by the old Timer Digest. And because I knew these 2 additional cycles, I caught that more accurately than anybody else did, which made me #1 for the year. So now here we are in 2025. This is the 1, 4, and 10-year cycles added together. I'm going to go back and go over this, but here we are. Red is the 1-year cycle. That very, very rarely ever changes, because it's based on 134 years worth of data. It's if you put it on a calendar, it shows a decline. Well, here, we do it for the year starts when the sun hits 0 Aries, but there you see the usual fall decline, September, October. The 1929 crash causes a great deal of that decline. The blue is the 4-year cycle, which is the election year cycle. And the green is the 10-year, which obviously it's longer term, so it's got sort of a more smooth, less of a slope, and it's very smooth. So now these are dynamic cycles. These are different. They're extracted from the data, my program, using sine wave analysis. It's then tested for profitability. In other words, how much money do you make? And this is what I get. So it shows, let me explain how to read it. It shows it's contributing sort of a down movement here into, this is why I think, see, February and March, I'm adding the cycles together in my head. February is weak in the post-election year. The one of the other cycles shows March being weak. Well, I showed you the addition of the 1, 4, and 10-year cycle. Then you get a rally up here. Then you get a pretty, June is usually down. Well, this is down also. So June's probably going to be down. So you're probably going to have a fairly choppy first half and then a bottom sometime here. And remember, the average low of the year is September, it's October 27. But here it might be a bit early and you have a very strong fourth quarter. Actually, 60% of all S&P profits from 1928 occur in the fourth quarter of the year. If you go short, if you sell short or expect a declining market, you're eating soup with a fork, you're walking up the down escalator, and you're standing on Mighty Mouse's cape. It is not the thing to do. Now, this is gold. Gold is, this cycle's fairly reliable, and it shows the gold should be peaking soon. It's already pretty high, as we know, and then it's coming down into March. March is the weakest month for the gold price, then a rally up into the summer, and then down the rest of the year. So it does not look like a great year for gold. Neptune brings inflation. Inflation usually spikes when Neptune is at a cardinal point. And coming up, the January 2026 Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 Aries is likely to dampen this trend. Well, first of all, there was an old out-of-print book by Barry Lyons called Astroeconomics, in which he pointed out that Neptune at cardinal points usually brings price inflation. Saturn-Neptune usually counteracts that. So we're going to have a warm front meeting a cold front here, or a cat fighting a dog, or whatever you want to call it, a real conflict here in January 2026. So we'll see what happens. And I just want to go back a little. I want to go back to this. When you run, this is the same cycles that the Foundation for the Study of Cycles runs. I have my own code, and I altered it a great deal to strengthen it. When you run this type of analysis with the sine waves, it assumes every cycle is circular. Now, let me ask you, are the orbits of the planet circular? No, they're elliptical. That's why, if you do all of this type of stuff, you'll miss this. Because this, we know, Mars orbit, it's not circular, it's elliptical. And October, what are we in now? 2024, October 2022, there was a major low in the stock market. Well, Mars was retrograde right down here in Gemini. In other words, it was stuck in the go mode. It was stuck in the bullish mode. And I've tried to explain this to people, and they sit down with their computers, they create a 1.8-year cycle. They assume it's a circle. They assume that the amount of time to go from the 0 to 180 is the same as the amount of time it takes to go from 180 back to 360. That's the advantage. That's what I call the astro edge. You realize these things are elliptical. And I've met people who've tried to do this type of analysis who are from Wall Street. And one guy did a perfectly reasonable, very excellent study. He used heliocentric planets, because he didn't know about geocentric, and he used conjunctions and oppositions, and that's it. He didn't know the other angles even mattered. So that's an advantage one has when using this, but it takes a long time to put them all together and understand them. So that is why most analysts miss the planetary cycles. They're looking for circles when they should be looking for ellipses. Now, this very bad copy, because I had to push a book onto the printer, onto the scanner, is the USA Central Bank Balance Sheet. This is going to explain everything. Starting in the year 1900, it's right out of the book by, the world's biggest hedge fund manager up in Connecticut, whose name I cannot remember now. And his book is not in this bookshelf. It's in my other bookshelf. It'll come to me in a minute. But in other words, they print money, and with money, they buy assets. So if Mexico goes bust and the bonds are worth 10 cents on the dollar, they come in and they buy them. They give Mexico 100 cents on the dollar. They put the Mexican bonds on their balance sheet as an asset worth $1, but they're only worth 10 cents. And back years ago, they changed, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation in which more than 50% of the stock is held by the major New York City banks. And they took a lot of the data and they took it off the balance sheet. And a friend of mine called up and said, well, where is, the breakdown? Where's, for example, the Mexican bonds he bought? He said, oh, it's true we hold Mexican bonds, but we're not going to tell you, how much we hold or where it is anymore. So just remember that, look at that straight line up there. Now, here's real house prices in Amsterdam from the year 1620. Does that look familiar? Now, oops, I went the wrong direction. And here's U of Michigan current value of stock market investments. Do those look familiar? And here is something I got we were at Carnegie Hall, and this is up on a wall in a diner, coffee house nearby there. In 1961, you could have seen Bob Dylan for $2. Now, if you had a graph of Bob Dylan ticket prices, it's probably going to look just like that. And this is home equity is near an all-time high at 135% of GDP. In other words, and here's the average price of electricity per kilowatt hour in the San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward, California area. Do those all look the same? Well, they should, because it's inflation that is driving all these prices. And somebody said, do you think, I was in Abu Dhabi, and this old white-haired gent from Singapore said, do you think we're in a bubble? In a bubble? Yeah, everything's in a bubble. But the suit I'm wearing, the car I'm driving, the food we eat, everything is, the prices are inflated. The prices are inflated because the central bank of the United States keeps cranking out money. And if you look at their horoscope, which I first wrote up in '83, it's all cardinal points. So the cardinal points means whatever they do affects the entire world, which is certainly true. And last but not least, here we have top 10 long-term timers. Now, at the end of Timer Digest simply ranked people who wrote newsletters. They had to follow you for 1 year before they would even rank you. And it was put together by the guy who was the head of research at PaineWebber, where I went to work in '85, just as he left and retired. And he started this to do something in his retirement. And he ran it for, I don't know how many years. And it was very old software. And when the new platforms wouldn't wouldn't run their software anymore, they just folded it up rather than pay the price. But anyway, and at the end of 19 years, they published that 19-year chart I could not find, but it was the same as this. James Stack is number 1, Nathan Campbell number 2, I was number 3. Tim Bost is also an astrologer, is number 6. Actually, I think he finished at 8, but you had 2 astrologers in the top 10. There are 170 advisors in that survey. Arch Crawford was the first one to ever get into it. There were 2 from Vienna, Marcus Rose, he's not in Vienna anymore, and Manfred Zimmel. Now we're up to 3. Tim Bost is 4, I'm 5, and the siderealist out in Iowa, what's his name? Out in Fairfield, Iowa. He does sidereal astrology. There are only 6 out of 170, and yet when I went through the last issue they put out, you had 2 guys out of in the top 10 who were astrologers. There were only 6 of 170, and you had guys who were number 1 or 2 and top 10 in gold, top 10 in bonds, top 10 here. And if you'd figured out mathematically, that means the astrologers were, on average, the 6 of us were well above everybody else in terms of forecasting, as measured by Timer Digest, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And that's the predictive power of eclipse paths. That's mastering geopolitical prediction. That's In Search, volumes 1 and 2. That's the old Charles Jane magazine. I've done 2 of them, and I can't quite get myself to do any more because it's such a nightmare, because these were printed. They were mimeographed sheets. Do you remember mimeo machines stapled together? And what a hassle that was to deal with. And that's it, if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Bill. That was so interesting. We have some questions. Let's start answering a few of them. How do you think the Venus retrograde will impact finances?
When is Venus going retrograde again? Tell me.
March 1st through April 15th, I believe, in the
Okay,
sign
well,
of
I did,
Aries.
NCGR did a study, did a, was it Valentine's Day presentation, and they asked me to do something with Venus in the market, so I did the Venus stations. And Venus can be very, very, I look up all the stations, Venus is the most effective. And then I was paid by one of my clients, an institution, to prepare lessons on every market. And I extended the Venus retrograde and direct periods into many other markets, and it's very significant. I don't remember what it is anymore because I did about 30 markets. But it is a lecture, and I'm probably going to put it together. And by the way, we're the stock market information is at cyclesresearch.com under my real name, Bill Cerubi, and the pen name, that's billmeridian.com. But it's so big and so full that we're creating right now a new one called billmeridianastrology.com, which I hope to bring back the old Dell form, mundane and stock predictions that I did for Dell for 30 years. So that is not up yet. Cyclesresearch.com has been completely redone. So yeah, Venus is very significant, but I'm sorry, I don't have the information in front of me at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, and there was a question about dignities and debilities. So, do you take these into account with
I've never looked at them.
okay. And do you anticipate deflation in 2025?
What in 2025?
Deflation.
No, no, the definition, well, I'm an adherent of the Austrian School of Economics, which was started by Karl Menger in 1871 and made, I think, famous by Ludwig von Mises in 1910. And it's very simple. The point I was trying to make is the old days, you take your gold to the blacksmith, he gives you a paper receipt. Well, if the blacksmith isn't honest, he can start handing out receipts and say, well, I've got the gold. If everybody goes to him with the receipts, the guy's out of business and he's probably going to get chased out of town, if not strung up. And well, this has been institutionalized. And I didn't understand it back in 71 when Nixon took the US off the gold standard, but my professor said apparently we're going into a period of permanent institutionalized inflation. And he was right. The definition of inflation is you print more money than the market or the economy needs. In other words, if you have too many strawberries, the price of strawberry falls. So prices don't go up. The value of each individual Federal Reserve note goes down. And at the end of World War II, with Neptune in the first decan of Libra, the book is right over here, Monetary Sin of the West by Jacques Rueff, who is de Gaulle's advisor. They said, the US dollar is backed by gold. And so every foreign country who had US dollars figured, well, I can always trade these dollars in for gold. So every country inflated their currency based upon the number of dollars they had. But what they didn't realize is the United States didn't have enough gold to cover. They were printing too many dollars well beyond any gold. And so Nixon had to close the gold window in 71. In June of 1980, Jimmy Carter signed the Monetary Control Act, which says the Federal Reserve could buy up anything and put it on their balance sheet as an asset. So they could buy the credit card debt of all of us and they could hold that as an asset. So if you think they're going to stop doing this, you're wrong. It's only a question of whether there's more or less inflation. So, the people on the news they say, well, they say inflation and they're referring to rising prices. No, rising prices are the result of inflation. So that's the definition. And Jupiter, Neptune very definitely rule that, and Saturn, Neptune rule the opposite.
Great. And why don't we do this last one and then we'll save the others to the end? Is
Sure.
the crypto market correlating with the same or similar cycles as the Dow Jones?
I haven't looked at it yet because I just got back here to Vienna and I needed my old PC here because I started researching crypto data. And I think TradingView has it going back about 20 years. And the other sources that I saw when I was in New York for the last 7 months, it was just 10 years. And you really need like 20, 30, 40, 50. The more you have, the better. But I really can't answer your question at that point, but I'm planning, now that I'm back in my office and have all the computers in front of me, I can start working on it.
Wonderful. Oh, and one easy question. Were you referring to Ray Dalio in Connecticut?
Yes, Ray Dalio wrote the book that I have. It's funny, I feel like I know him. He's best friends with one of the big Arabs in Abu Dhabi, whom I know, but I've never met Ray. And Ray used to run ads in the Wall Street Journal looking for analysts. And I kept saying to myself, I'm in New York in Greenwich Village. I don't want to live up in Connecticut. And so as a result, I never connected with him.
Okay. Well, there's another couple, but in the interest of time, we'll save them
Sure.
till the end. Thank you for
Okay.
sharing your wisdom, Bill. That was
Oh, you're
so
most welcome.
interesting.
I think I have to turn this back to you, don't I?
Well, you just turn off your camera and then
Nice.
we'll
I
have
hit stop share.
you're not sharing. We'll have Colin come live. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Celeste. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Let me introduce you.
Sure.
So, Colin Bedell is an artist who uses astrology as his as his primary medium to explore identity and relationships. As the co founder of Queer Cosmos, a comparative astrological resource for LGBTQIA plus individuals and their allies, Colin's work blends spirituality and scholarship with accessible, integrative content. Well and Good magazine recognized Colin as one of the most influential people in the wellness industry. Colin is also the weekly horoscope writer for cosmopolitan.com and has authored 3 best-selling books on astrology. He appeared as an astrologer on the Discovery Plus show Written in the Stars and has been featured on Good Morning America, New York Magazine, MTV, and the Sunday Times in the United Kingdom. Colin is committed to teaching and practicing astrology as an art form, using symbolic language, humor, visuals, science, and dance to provide meaningful insights, vitality, and a sense of belonging to his students. His website is colinbedell.com, and his Instagram channel, which is a must follow, is Queer Cosmos. So, welcome, Colin, my friend. I'm so excited to hear your wisdom.
Thank you so much, Celeste. And I just have to say, I don't think I've ever followed an astrologer that had such a pronounced Northeast accent. So, Bill, I have to say, I am so glad to be following in your footsteps, Jersey boy, okay? Because I'm usually the only one that just really butchers his vowels when he has to speak. So I just love that I'm following Bill's accent because I'm from Long Island. So this is really nice. Okay, but that is not why I'm here to tell you about my linguistics. I am here to share, stand by, I believe, the screen this way. Wonderful. And I'm going to present my slide right now. Okay. So, what I'm going to be discussing with all of you is technically a transit that is going to be exact on February 20th, 2026. But what my thought is that we're going to have a lot of anticipatory evidence of what we're going to see on February 20th, 2026, when Saturn enters Aries, beginning when Saturn enters Aries on May 25th of 2025 until September 1st. So Saturn will be in Aries once again, May 25th, 2025 to September 1st. And then it will return to Aries on February 14th, 2026, where it will stay until 2028. And then Neptune enters Aries on March 30th, 2025, where it will stay until October 20th of 2025, and then return to Aries on January 26th, 2026, where it will stay until 2038. So those are the key dates that should set the stage here. And let me start my 30-minute timer because Saturn has entered the chat, all right? And so what I want to animate is this idea that perhaps a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries can move us from worry to wonder and panic to progress. Now, a Saturn-Neptune conjunction marks a pivotal moment where structures dissolve, dreams take form, and humanity is challenged to transform fear into resilience, bridging the gap between the tangible and the transcendent. And for context, what I just wanted to walk you through here, and I'd love for you to pay particular attention to 1917 and 1952, because I'll be talking about 1989 pretty extensively, is the fact that in 1917, when we had our last Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Leo, some key themes that emerged there were creativity under pressure, leadership during crisis, obviously World War I, redefining individuality through collective efforts. And this conjunction marked a world reshaping itself, right, through war, forging creative leadership and collective resilience in the face of destruction. In 1952 to 1953, when we had a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra, the key themes were justice and diplomacy, balancing partnerships, post-World War II alliances, and the emergence of civil rights movements. As the ashes of World War II settled, this era bridged divides through diplomacy and justice, sowing seeds for equity and collaboration. We're going to talk about 1989 extensively, and then we'll cover 2026. But I just thought for the people who think in systems, this could be helpful to know as we cover the data moving forward. So, from Leo's creative resilience during wartime to Libra's quest for justice and balance, through Capricorn's structural collapse and technological rebirth, and now Aries' bold reinvention, the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions trace humanity's journey of dismantling the old to build something more vital, connected, and alive. Each cycle reminds us that endings are beginnings and renewal is born from our courage to confront fear and embrace change. Now, what I want to take the stance here is that Eros is an Aries ruled concept. So if anybody has been connected with Aries from friends to family to lovers to something in between, you sort of know there's an erotic energy to them. Now, when I say erotic, let me just make myself perfectly clear. I'm not necessarily talking about the mechanics of sex. I think sometimes somatically when we review Aries, or when we review eroticism, excuse me, we can get a little caught up in the mechanics of sexuality. What I'm actually talking about is a vitality, a life force, creativity, and connection. And if you have experienced some of the highest expressions of Aries, they are fully vitalized. They are creative individuals, and I think they are often seeking connection, albeit the Ram way, but still their way, right? And I want to review a couple of ideas with you that Eros is often a defiance against death and decay, and that Eros is also a force for meaning and oftentimes a life affirming action. Okay, so once again, when we talk about Eros, I want us to hold a context around vitality, life force. Okay, and could it be that Aries is teaching us who am I when I'm fully alive? What am I doing when I'm fully alive? Who am I with when I'm fully alive? And what are we trying to achieve together to take a stand for life force when we live in systems and sometimes countries that frankly take a stand for death more often than not? What does it mean for us to take a stand for life force when we live in cultures and pandemics that honestly generate collective deadness? I believe that Aries helps us hold that question. Okay. And so Georges Bataille wrote, Eros compels connection, but also uncovers resolved tensions, transforming us and bringing our vulnerabilities to light. So, why Saturn Neptune in Aries? Now, what I want to just kind of review is that the last Saturn Neptune conjunction that we had was the year that I was born, 1989. And this whole presentation actually started because I found a documentary, which I'm now going to share with you here in the group chat, called 1989, The Year That Made Us. And I just saw this on National Geographic. I was like, oh, that's cool. That's the year I was born. Let me learn a little bit more about this, right? And this is fully free, by the way. So let me go ahead and send this to you if you guys want to watch this even more. Stand by to everyone. All right, there we go. And I knew the Berlin Wall collapsed the year that I was born, but I had no idea these other historical, life-defining chronicles that took place in 1989. And then when I tracked it to Saturn Neptune in the Saturn Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, it really just rocked my world. And so I'm so grateful that I have a place to put it in this presentation. And I'll also be talking about it more at NORWAC next spring. But what I want to now go back to, so hold on one second here, okay, was that we have three significant events from the Berlin Wall to the internet being born and other cultural shifts. And my theory is that perhaps the next Saturn-Neptune conjunction that we have in Aries on February 20th, 2026 is going to help us revisit some of those themes. And we're going to actually cover them now. But those themes, just to kind of zoom out first, have to do with, of course, confronting our fear with that Aries ruled valor. We're going to potentially redefine systems, specifically technological ones. And then also, I do believe that Aries does foster connection, Sometimes, often through conflict. I think if I wasn't an astrologer, I would be a couples therapist. I've received an extensive amount of training in conflict management and repair after discord. And I genuinely believe that astrologers could take a bit of a software update in discussing why conflict can be a better bridge to connection, why conflict is necessary in order for us to find our way back to each other. And I do believe that some of those conflict and discord ruled themes are genuinely very Aries. Okay. Now, once again, 1989, the year that made us, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall on November the 9th, 1989. The birth of the internet as a public tool began in 1989, and also the rise of sensationalism in media. And I think the Central Park jogger case is an incredible example. So, for those who just want a quick little historical refresh, so the Central Park jogger case is when somebody was assaulted in Central Park, and the media went nuts, assuming that it was the Central Park Five, who were five young Black men in Central Park, and they were eventually acquitted. And we're going to cover this, but I'll give a quick little spoiler alert. In that year, our next American president, Donald Trump, released a full page ad. I believe it was in the New Yorker that said, "Bring back the death penalty" for the Central Park Five, and they were all eventually acquitted. So, what are some themes here? Once again, the convergence of sensationalism in theoretically an objective space like the media, the internet completely dissolved systems of separation. Thank you, Saturn, Neptune, right? To just generate an extensive amount of information. And then I think what's super interesting about the fall of the Berlin Wall has to do with a British journalist was there. I'm blanking on her name, but it's in my piece. And she called 1989 the year of unexpected and joyful liberation. And when I heard that, I was so moved. I was like, whoa, I wonder if that could be something else that can emerge in 2026. And so, once again, key themes here: connection, division, and disruption. Now, Eros, right? We're talking about life force. We're talking about vitality. Where was that unity through the Berlin's Wall fall? I did not know kind of what happened next around what was happening in Berlin at the time, but just watching the footage was so touching of just folks reconnecting, this energy of intimacy and connection. And then, of course, the digital connectivity emerged to provide a new frontier of connection, because once again, Eros is not just conflict vitality, but it's also how do I connect with you, right? Eros is looking to find connection and differentiation. But I think tracing the emergence of the internet to 1989 is something fascinating. And then we saw challenges of sensationalism and division there as well, from the Central Park jogger case to other examples. What I don't know if anybody was tracking how there was this huge resurgence of interest in the Menendez brothers, right? So I don't know if folks were noticing that last summer. There was a television show that came out by Ryan Murphy called Monsters, I believe, and the murder actually took place in 1989. Right. So I just thought that was fascinating. And now history is revisiting that case with a more gentle lens of like, wait a minute, what really happened here? Right. So, what's ahead? When we think of Aries energy, naturally we're thinking about boldness, action, and transformation, that cardinal fire that wakes us up. Okay. And my question, and this is largely informed by astrologer Maurice Fernandez, who I'm about to quote, and you can have access to his article momentarily. I believe that 2026's Saturn Neptune conjunction could really offer us some digital accountability, authenticity in media, and then also creativity over commodification based on some things that took shape in 1989. So I really love this quote by Zora Neale Hurston. She discusses something of zombification, which symbolizes a loss of autonomy and vitality under oppressive systems. Now, we could spend the next 7 hours from a global context, as I know that many of us here are not from the United States, so I don't want to make this American centric, but we are technically, I think, living, some of us more than others, under oppressive systems, and there's a zombification that may emerge because these oppressive systems are hell-bent on removing other people's autonomy and vitality. And so once again, how does Eros wake us up from zombification and connect us to our humanity and full vitality because of these systems that would really rather us not? So challenges in the digital space, right? So in 1989, the internet connects us. And then today, social media divides us through outrage and misinformation. And then could it be that 2025 and 2026 allows us to reclaim agency and use digital tools for unity? Because one of the episodes, spoiler alert, in the 1989 documentary had to do with a tagline called, "If it bleeds, it leads," right? So I think that's why we saw this huge coverage of the Menendez murders in 1989, because the cable viewers were, the cable networks were realizing, wow, so murder, gossip, all of the drama, it captivates people, right? And so I just wondered, if it bleeds, it leads from 1989 to the social media algorithm, which, although not totally verified, tends to have a similar culture. If it bleeds, it leads. I know damn well that on some of the social media streets out here, right? The astrology content that tends to perform better is dramatic, emotionally inflammable. Every week is another life-changing transit. It's like, wow, can we get a break already? So it's just, I wonder, are we seeing an echo from my birth year now, right? So this conjunction, this is from Maurice's article. So it's titled "The Great Saturn-Neptune Conjunction at 0 degrees Aries." And he writes, "This conjunction may question our relationship with technology and accountability." And I would completely agree with that. So if you want to investigate his article further, and he has this great tagline, "When walls fall and heroes rise." I just thought that was so gorgeous. So would definitely love it if you could check out Maurice's work there. And so, as I've said earlier, media sensationalism then and now, 1989, there were fear-driven narratives like the Central Park jogger case. My question is, how do algorithms, similarly back then, amplify anger and division? And could it be, and forgive me for surrounding myself with too many Sagittarians, so I've become a little bit more optimistic, shift focus to meaningful, life-affirming stories? Could it be? I believe we actually are already going in that direction. Ever since the presidential election in America, I'm already noticing Americans' tolerance for anger and division just very, very low. That happened very quick. That's my quick observation. I could be wrong. I sound convinced. I'm sure of nothing, right? But what I have seen is in my country, people are really decreasing their tolerance level for anger and fear and contempt. So wouldn't that be nice? Okay. Something that I wanted to throw out there, because again, when we talk about 1989, we're typically thinking about the Berlin Wall and the internet, but there's actually other qualities that began there. And I do believe they have a strong correlation to eroticism and eros. So in 1989, there was an increase, a real beginning of the commodification of media, especially in franchises. So I knew that The Little Mermaid came out in 1989, but I had no idea that that movie and Disney unleashed this sort of franchise just driven culture. Batman 2 came out that year. The Game Boy came out, which technically was the earliest prototype of the cell phone, right? What does this look like? Okay. And so, what I've heard from my friends who I've connected with pretty well over artist residencies, and astrologers, please apply to artist residencies, because as we'll see here, eroticism and the arts are very, very, very tethered. And I believe that all of us have something really meaningful to share. But my friends who are involved in film and television are often saying that if it doesn't have a high likelihood of commodification, franchise, and a significant economic return on investment, right, then these networks, these producers, these hosts are not often going to pick up the art. So today we're seeing, kind of metrics over meaning when it comes to arts, because I don't necessarily believe that back in 1989 beforehand, the arts was purely about show business, as you know, business is in the term, right? So it wasn't always, but I believe that the appetite for commodification, franchise, money has obviously never been higher. And so I wonder, does 2025 kind of offer us an Eros-inspired creative culture that connects and heals, that doesn't just turn over enormous amount of profits to streamers, to networks, to record labels, right? So something to wonder. And next here, back to collective healing and Eros. So Eros as a collective force drives aliveness and connection. And I do believe, thanks to the work of Jack Saul, who I'm going to quote in the next slide, enables resilience and agency. So concurrently with the North Node about to enter Pisces in less than a month now, I think, depending on if we're using true or mean, right? So within a month, I feel really good about a Virgo Pisces axis because if I've learned anything from my mutable brethren, Virgo and Pisces knows how to put forward ritual, routine to provide collective healing and a kind of like punctuation of reality, right? So just want to throw that out there as well, that Eros can be really energizing when we're thinking about rituals and when we're thinking about routines as well. So, Jack Saul, the narrative and participatory practices help communities reclaim agency and transform traumatic experiences into resilience. So, Jack Saul wrote a really phenomenal text called Collective Trauma, Collective Resilience. And him and his wife, Esther Perel, a really celebrated Belgian couples therapist, were living in the financial district on September 11th, 2001. And they both put so much of their psychological training and expertise into effect throughout the communities in the financial district after 9/11. And what Jack realized was that narrative, participatory practices, the arts help communities living in tremendous collective trauma reclaim agency and transform those experiences into resilience, right? So again, eroticism, the arts, narrative, participatory practices, this is a big ask and we have quite a while, but this is what I would love perhaps astrologers to hold the question of is how can we use our work and our practice to provide experiences and tools that generate aliveness, that generate resilience after our clients or our readers, if you have a practice in that way, have endured a traumatic experience. Now, hello, we obviously got to talk about the heavy Plutonian power here. So collective transformation is key. We're no longer living, you know, theoretically in that kind of rugged individualist Pluto and Capricorn. It's all about me and making sure that I work on myself, right? How do we live in more networks of resilience and empowerment, mass mutual reliance? Martin Luther King called it the inescapable network of mutuality, right? What can we do to hold Pluto and Aquarius in this way? And then aligning Eros with justice and community care. And that's the idea here around Jack Saul, right? So Eros and community care, narrative, participatory practices, theater, music, dance. This is such a life-affirming approach that truly, I believe, has much more capacity to heal than maybe we realize, okay? So when we're harnessing Eros for change, we are trying to embrace bold action, accountability, and creativity. We are guiding conflict towards constructive outcomes. Folks, there are so many free resources on conflict management from the Gottman Institute to the Imago Institute and Safe Conversations practices. I would love for us to, because I feel like our culture is just getting increasingly conflict averse, which I get it, right? We don't live in schools and cultures and institutions that help us navigate conflict constructively. But if we as astrologers are wisdom keepers, right? I would love for us to really think about, what can I do to really train myself in conflict management and then hold those theories in conversation and the systems, frankly, in conversation with my clients as well. because Eros can foster empathy and connection in divisive times. We saw those examples in 1989, 1953, 1917. Okay. And so, never in a million years, I thought I would quote George H.W. Bush, not my favorite president, but I just thought, wow, what an interesting quote. So, when he was inaugurated in 89, he wrote, "A new breeze is blowing for in man's heart, if not in fact, the day of the dictator is over. The totalitarian era is passing, its old ideas blown away like leaves from an ancient, lifeless tree." Wouldn't that be something? So, call to action, right? Reclaim Eros in your work and relationships as best as you can. And what I want to think about too, Mars retrograde, this is a wonderful time to generate this idea, is what does it mean for all of us to own our wantings? Because when we talk about Eros, there's a connection to wanting, to desire, and wanting and desire is a very complicated concept, especially, for sociocultural reasons. And so what I would love for you to consider is how can I own my wanting with a little bit more unapologetic quality, right? And as I do that, as I want, I feel fully alive. I want a better life for myself, for my citizens. I want to take a stand for vitality. I want to be a person who leads in ways that brings others with them so that they can have full aliveness as well. What's the correlation between wanting between I should say among wanting, desire, and eroticism, because I think that's where we can also hold a little bit more those Aries philosophies of being the fact that Aries is a very brave sign at its highest expression. It allows us to manage and move through the discomfort of wanting with greater bravery, right? It's terrifying for many of us to own our wantings and name and normalize it in real time. It takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of strength, right? But again, we're talking about Aries, the benefit of the beginner's mind, the very first sign that says, hey, try it anyway. Fall in love like it's the first time. Say, I want this like you never experienced rejection before. Don't live in anticipatory disappointment. What future? What past? Aries is the here and now. So if we own our wanting in real time as best as we can really move, I think, from living in a mausoleum, which it seems like many of us, because of the cultures, and this isn't our fault, but it is our responsibility. Many of us are already living in a collective mausoleum, and I just really want us to think about an Aries energy that says, not me, not anymore. I'm over it. And here's how I'm going to do it. And then, of course, creating a collective future grounded in life affirming action. Because for me, if last time I checked, I don't remember if this is totally accurate, so forgive me if it isn't, but I just cannot physically fathom the fact that half of my country's GDP is going to the military industrial complex, that half of my country's wealth is dedicated to defending and armor and killing people. Like I cannot stomach that. What would it mean for the United States economy to, I don't know, provide life-affirming support that helps our citizens fly a full wingspan, that gives women and children economic opportunities, that addresses, there's no reason why such a wealthy nation does so little to address unnecessary economic suffering to its people. It's just, and Americans are trained to expect so little. It makes absolutely no sense to me. So there we go. All right, and I think that was the last slide. And I just want to say one more time because I'm doing good. I think I got 5 more minutes. Woo! Saturn, I hope you're proud. So the theory around a lot of this actually came from Jacques Saul's wife, Esther Perel, who, as I said, is a Belgian couples therapist, but lives in New York and lectures and travels internationally. So she is a daughter of Holocaust survivors. And she noticed, because when she was living in Belgium in a sort of refugee settlement of newly liberated Jews, what she noticed as a child was that there was two sort of populations of people. There were the Jews who did not have the historical hindsight that we have, right? So they lived in very understandable and valid fear that there would be another Nazi occupation. So very hypervigilant, very tethered to the ground, didn't want to let themselves enjoy anything too much because what if it gets taken away, right? And so they were really trying to make sure that they were staying safe, right? And then she noticed that there was another sort of community of people who used eros, music, laughter, song, dance, play, to bring themselves back to life. So Esther Perel's animating theory in so much of her work is that the erotic is an antidote to death. And I think who better than her and her experiences and her family and her ancestry to name that truth. The erotic becomes an antidote to death, right? Audre Lorde teaches on this extensively. A Black feminist lesbian talks extensively on eroticism as a way to take a stand for pleasure and name the fact that because I connect to eros and I connect to pleasure, I refuse to accept anything that defaces my confidence, that puts me in lower energy. Refuse, right? And this is not all about me, all about mine. It's liberation. It's dreaming a better future. It's taking a stand for other people's life force, even in systems and cultures and experiences that would want you to do anything but, right? So these are just some ideas that I'm working out with. Thankfully, I have a lot of Aries women, Celeste's Aries moon as such an example, who show me what this means on a day-to-day basis. Actually, I have no personal planets in Aries. I wish I did. So I just surround myself with them. And when I notice the common denominators that they have, this is what I see. So hopefully this informs and maybe motivates you in a really specific way. And that's all I have. So I'll hit stop share and bring it over back to Celeste.
Oh, Colin, that was wonderful. So
Thank you, honey.
interesting. We have a question here.
Sure.
How do you define commodification? Can you go deeper?
Yes. So when we're talking about commodification of culture, we're talking about how, as I remember it from the documentary, movies like The Little Mermaid prior to 1989 did not have this kind of opportunity then generated a massive amount of revenue through product, through franchise, a movie was just a movie. But as we see now, a movie has to have 7 different sequels, licensing agreements, franchises. Like it can't just exist for the arts and meaning, it has to exist for metrics and money. So my friends who are involved in film and television are saying like, I don't even want to bring my ideas to the networks anymore because if it doesn't have a kind of, Marvel, Avengers, several different spin-offs and action figures and this and that, they're just going to say no. So the commodification is the kind of the heavy economic turnover, really, right? And the extracting of the meaning to just make sure that all these people get a great deal of the profit, but not actually the artists. What? Anyway,
Mhm. Yeah, great. And do you use the asteroid Eros with your work?
I don't, and maybe much to my dismay. So I will look into that. So thank you for the person who recommended that. I really should. I guess I just watched too many Aries women, Celeste, as you know. And dance with them on a dance floor, baby.
Absolutely. We'll be at Norwalk dancing for
You better
sure.
believe it. Okay. Hopefully others here.
Yes, and so they're wonderful comments and you can check them out.
Do.
Beth, please put your question in the question mark. Beth raised their hand. And thank you so much, Colin. We'll bring you back later for
Great.
any last
Yeah,
questions.
looking forward to Lynn's right now. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. We so appreciate your wisdom. Great. Hi,
Wonderful.
Lynn. Let
Hi,
me
Celeste.
give you a quick introduction.
Okay.
Lynn Bell has been a consulting astrologer for over 4 decades, looking deeply into the unfolding cosmos and the way it emerges in the lives of each person she works with. She now teaches online for Astrology University and MISPA and has spoken at conferences and schools all over the world. Among her many passionate adventures in astrology is the exploration of family inheritance and the craft of solar returns. In 2016, Lynn was awarded the Charles Harvey Award for excellence, exceptional service to astrology. Her website is lynnbellastrology.com, and I'll put her social links in the chat. Welcome, Lynn. We're so excited to hear your wisdom.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to put up my PowerPoint here. Okay, let's see. Can you see that? Right.
Yes, we
Now,
can see it.
okay, great. And I'm just going to put it into play mode. So I called Uranus and Gemini the wake-up call. And I mean, Uranus is always the wake-up planet, so we could, but why in Gemini? Because it seems to, first of all, we leave the earth element. I did a lot of presentations on Uranus and Taurus 7 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. And what we've kind of seen, just to go back a little bit and think about what has Uranus and Taurus brought us and what is it still bringing us? Well, this sense of basic instability with the very foundation of our world, the earth, is one thing. But also, Taurus has a lot to do with what we have, what we own, and how we possess things. And this desire to possess and to have more and to keep going, to eat until we drop, to consume until we drop, all of that got extreme, and the desire to control or to have what other people have. I mean, we see that in a lot of different places in the world right now. So one of I'm just going to very quickly switch slides. As Uranus goes into Gemini, new archetypes will be seeded into the collective. Now, I live in Paris, so I'm not usually only United States centric, but Uranus in Gemini is extremely important to the US, the history of the United States. And so we will be talking more about that. And I apologize for that. And as I look at this more, I'll be looking much wider afield. So outer planet sign changes, they wake up different archetypes, but of course, Gemini splits in two. And Gemini corresponds to splitting, doubling, multiple points of view, to a kind of fracture. And when at its most extreme, Gemini, of course, is dealing with the shadow, the Jekyll and Hyde self, and our own relationships with our own shadow. But Gemini is also a sign of ingenuity, invention, humor, and intelligence. So when Uranus enters Gemini on July 7th, 2025, and it will stay until November 8th, it's going to immediately start moving things. Gemini is a sign that does not stay still. It likes the energy of Uranus. We can connect Uranus with this. Uranus means sky in Greek. So of course, as a sky god, as the god of out there, it's happier in air signs where it's free to invent. It's not bound by form. Uranus isn't done with Taurus, though. It goes back in November 8th and back into Gemini on April 6, 2026, for good. And then it stays till 2033. So, of course, all of you know that during its stay, Uranus will be part of an important emphasis on air and fire. So it will immediately join, it may not immediately trine Pluto and Aquarius exactly, but it will sextile Neptune and Saturn in early Aries. So all of a sudden, there's a very strong movement in a completely new dimension, in a completely new energetic field. And none of us have felt this for many years, where all the outer planets are in the masculine elements, what used to be called the masculine elements. My friend Christopher Renstrom referred to this as the hyper-masculinization of the zodiac. I'm not sure that's exactly how it will work out, but it's rather than dreaming or just more or less passively absorbing the multiple spells of the internet with Neptune in Pisces, we're going to have Neptune in Aries. And while I loved how Cullen talked about the positive side of that, I think we could all enumerate as well the shadow aspects of any archetypal situation. And I want to talk about that a little bit today because Gemini says there's more than one direction. Now, so one of the questions is, which way will we go? We will start to, there's multiple possibilities that will start to wake up. The other day, I saw a video on levity through sound, auditory levity, where actually people use sound waves to make things rise, to move things through the air. And I thought, oh, there's something like this which is coming, some kind of new movement that doesn't weight us down, that doesn't have our hands all over it. One of the things, so again, remember, there isn't only one possibility with Uranus. It's almost as if we start to get fractures and fractals in the surface of our lives. And I can't imagine a monolithic control system with Uranus in Gemini. So Gemini can, of course, be sweet discovery and delight in the encounter. And that's, of course, what you see here, this kind of just, who are you? What are you? What do you do? What is this new thing? There's this new meeting, new encounter, new relatedness. And the drawing on the left, the drawing of the man on the horse, is actually the activity associated during the year with the sign Gemini. And this man, that's supposed to be a falcon on his hand. And this man is actually hunting. It's like he's sending something out in the sky in order to bring it down, to bring it in. So we're going to start bringing in and using many new ideas, many new encounters. There's like a dialogue that hasn't existed before with Uranus and Gemini. Here are some dates of the past passages of Uranus in Gemini. And you'll have these slides to go over later. So, but the last time Uranus was in Gemini was between 1941 and 1949. And, you know, during this period, if we want to talk about splitting, the world was literally split into two camps and divided into war during this time. Now, the war began with Uranus and Taurus in 1939, September 1939. But the United States entered the war on December 7th, 1941, with Uranus at about 29 degrees of Taurus. It had retrograded back in. But as you can see, the Uranus and Gemini energy was already here. In the passage prior to that, 1859 to 1866, we have the Civil War, which began in 1861. And the passage prior to that, you will recognize, we have the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, which begins again with Uranus and Gemini and Pluto in Capricorn, but Pluto goes into Aquarius during that time. And I'll be showing you some charts. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask, and I want each of you here today to think about, or invite each of you here to think about, is why is Gemini connected to war? We don't normally think of it as a sign that's particularly conflictual. And for the United States, there is something that must come to consciousness in order to activate a notion of freedom when Uranus is in Gemini. Okay, and so if the world starts to close in on us, if things seem to be too controlled externally. Uranus in Gemini is going to wake up a very powerful and firm desire for freedom. This is not a passage where things stay enslaved. Oh, I mean, we can discuss this. We can, there will always be exceptions. Now, there are other things that happen with Uranus in Gemini. It is, each of these passages corresponds to an acquisition of new ways of knowing. And particularly this one, I've researched these fairly intensively. In 1444 is supposed to be, around that time period, is the invention of the printing press. So the invention of the printing press meant that books which were rare, handwritten, which were all written by hand on parchment, which were rare, precious documents that only the rich could afford, only the church could afford, suddenly became available. Suddenly books became available. They were still expensive, but an ordinary person could imagine owning a book. And of course, the book that was soon printed, the most printed book, was the Bible. The first printed book was, one of the first printed books was the Gutenberg Bible. Now, the fact, this is really important because most people were illiterate at the time. And suddenly there was this ability to know or to learn things. That didn't exist before Uranus was before the printing press existed. And so when we go to the next cycle, 1523 to 1530, we're in the early stages of the Protestant Revolution. The Protestant Revolution begins in 1512, I want to say, with the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn, very similar, or the outer planets are in very similar places to our era. And basically people say, I don't want you to tell me what's right. I've been reading the Bible myself, and I do not agree that you can tell me, you can interpret God for me. I can interpret the written word for myself. It's impossible to imagine how fundamental this was, how revolutionary this was, how it blew everything out of the water. And so during this period, we have, of course, Europe begins to split into, or in many different pieces, particularly Northern Europe. And of course, Henry VIII splits from the Catholic Church, and England, the power of the church is broken. The power of an authority over our mind, over our relationship with spirit is broken. Then in the next, and each of these sessions, something in 1606, the first public library opened its doors in Milan, and this public library was Catholic, and it was full of books to promote the Catholic point of view, Catholic philosophy, as opposed to the Protestants, because the Protestants were all reading, whereas Catholics weren't. In the United States, at the time of the Revolution, New England was the place with the highest rate of literacy in the world. And this is was because it was founded by religious objectors who were interpreting the Bible, which was the book everyone read, in their own way. But each of these periods, in the late 17th century, in the 1690s, suddenly the rules on censorship of press are released, and rules on publishing are released, and many more books can be released, and newspapers begin to take off. And this period from 1690 until the mid-19th century, more and more newspapers are published, more and more, everyone begins to talk to each other on a collective level. There is a new way of bringing information around. So I just wanted to talk about those things before moving to the next slide. So Gemini as we know, is the relationship between siblings, between twins, between sisters. And while there are many other mythologies in the world, I'm a quarter Greek, so Greek mythology is part of my ancestral stream. And here is an image of Clytemnestra and Cassandra. Now, Clytemnestra and Cassandra ended up in the same household because Cassandra was a spoils. Clytemnestra was the queen, and Cassandra was the war concubine that Agamemnon, her husband, brought home. And as you know, Cassandra is someone who always knew what was going to happen, but nobody believed her. And she ended up being murdered by Clytemnestra when Clytemnestra killed her husband. So there's this notion of why do we destroy the other? Why in the biblical tradition, in the Christian mythos, is the first murder between two brothers. We can also see this as part of the Gemini archetype, that we want to eliminate something that we do not identify or we don't see as us, something that is too other. We want to eliminate, and this is, of course, what happened in World War II. Colin talked about the Holocaust, and this whole notion that there are people who aren't worthy of life. This division of the world into an us and them can be one of the possibilities of Uranus and Gemini, and it has happened in the past. So I've been thinking about it again, and it's not taking the Christian mythos. Gemini tastes from the tree of knowledge. What motivates Gemini more than knowing, communicating, finding out how are things connected? What is this? What is that? Imagine the dreadful eternity of living in a place where everything more or less everything is wonderful, but everything repeats. And of course, we can think of the paradise of Taurus, which is the smells and the sounds of the most beautiful things that have ever manifested on the earth. In physical manifestation, the flowers and the scents and the tastes and all the animals with their separate natures living together. But with the taste of the tree of knowledge, wanting to know what that is, that question is, what is it? How is it different from me? Where does it go? Tasting from the tree of knowledge in the Christian tradition brings the knowledge of good and evil. Suddenly means that we see the world completely differently. We see the world in a new way. So we think of Gemini as the eternal adolescent playing with possibility, taking nothing particularly seriously. And yet in Gemini, there is an awakening to the true nature of things and an awareness of the dual nature of the world. Light and shadow, good and bad, right and wrong, become part of the awareness of the sign. So the flash of awareness brought by Uranus will require a choice. It will require us, we're no longer in the time of Neptune and Pisces, where whatever you think and whatever you want is fine. And, it isn't like that. It requires a choice about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be true, what it means to be good. Okay. We might think that Gemini will never decide. And perhaps the shadow side of Uranus and Gemini is a kind of a collaboration, a kind of choosing not to choose, which is, of course, the archetype of Peter Pan, the puer aeternus. But I believe that Uranus in Gemini corresponds to war because it calls on us to choose. And it calls on us to take a side, to say, I can't just say that this is okay. I can't say that, a whole people being oppressed on the other side of the planet is fine with me. I can't just say, well, it happens, it's not my problem. There is, with Uranus and Gemini, sort of a waking up to what happens if we don't choose. While this transit also concerns the world in general, its importance for the US cannot be overstated. Okay, so with my astrological ear to the internet, I've heard affirmations about the dangers ahead, such as when Uranus enters Gemini, this country has always gone to war. Is it true that and it is true, that Uranus was in Gemini at the beginning of the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, and soon after the US entry into World War II? Is it happening again? Is the US headed down a path of misunderstanding and a lack of connection that will lead to inevitable conflict? So here is the Sibley chart, a chart that many use, although we know it's probably not a real event for the US. And you can see that in this chart, Uranus is angular, and one of the first charts for the United States had Uranus rising, the one that I used when I was a young astrologer. So this idea that the United States is a Uranian place was it became something that had never been seen in the world. A country that basically broke from the past and said, we will choose who we are. We have an idea of, we will not be slaves to rules that we have not chosen. And this, you will notice that Uranus in the US chart was trine to Saturn in Libra. And this is really important because in each of these charts, we will be seeing the Uranus Saturn trines. So here is the chart of the American Civil War, and some of you may have already looked at this. You will notice Neptune at 29 degrees, 56 minutes Pisces. It went into Aries the very next day. So this is the moment shots are fired on Fort Sumner. Again, we have Uranus almost at the same degree, 9 degrees of Gemini, conjunct Mars at 6 degrees of Gemini. And this time Uranus and Mars are square Saturn. There is and past the sextile, Uranus is already far past the sextile with Neptune. There's no aspect holding them together, although they will have an affinity through signs. But we can see that as Neptune goes into Aries, it will be quincunx that Saturn. So how do we interpret this? Well, again, the Civil War, what we're all taught as school children is that the Civil War is, fought to free the slaves. But of course, we know that there's an economic reality, that there was a law passed in 1850 called the Missouri Compromise that allowed new states to choose between free and slaveholding. And when the government prior to Lincoln wanted slavery to become a permanent factor in the United States, and wanted slaveholding to be the economic model. And all those Bible reading people in the North, all those people who, again, start with the printing of the Gutenberg Bible, the translations of the Bible, Luther's translation of the Bible into German in the next passage. And the passage after that of Uranus and Gemini is the King James Bible, which changed everyone's life because it was so beautifully written. And it became the most widely read book in the world and got into everybody's mind because it was spoken out loud, read on pages in your hotel room. So that energy made people think, no, it's not okay for me to treat another human being in this way. Uranus in Gemini confronts the split. And it makes a choice. It decides what is good and what is not acceptable because it can only lead to death and destruction. So I mean, I really have never thought about Gemini in this way, and I am a Gemini, as many of you know, in this particular way. And the symbolism of Mars in Gemini and Uranus in Gemini conjunct square Saturn, which is the use of another human being for my material benefit, or the recognition of another human being as a brother or a sister or as an equal. And this is what will come again. So if there is a regression early next year, which is possible with many planets retrograde, with the Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde and the big March eclipse pile up in Pisces, a lot of people feel heartbroken or crestfallen by the results of the election. And other people say it's just going to be business as usual. And if it isn't, if we are treating people in an inhuman way, Uranus and Gemini will wake us up. So here's an image of, you know, in the beginning, people thought it would last a few months. It lasted 4 years, and it's one of the wars that had the largest loss of life up until that time anywhere in the world. Just a huge number of young men were sacrificed to this idea of what is the nature of the place we live in. Okay, so whether there is a war or not, which I certainly hope there isn't going to be, and I don't think there's going to be, and I'll show you why. This notion of choosing is extremely important. So here is 1941, just to go back. Just to one more time, and this time Uranus is just coming. Notice this Uranus-Saturn relationship, how fundamental this is in all of these charts. Uranus is just coming off the conjunction of Saturn that happened in Taurus. It's in the first passage, which was August 41, and this probably was the year. You'll notice Uranus was in a sextile with Pluto. And at that particular moment, there was that conjunction of Pluto, Chiron, and Mercury in Leo. And 1941 and 1942 are the years that are considered to be the deadliest in human history, where most people, where so many people died, more people died than had ever died before. Okay, as I'm saying, there is this other side to Uranus and Gemini, but the sextile between two outer planets doesn't immediately turn into good. We need to make it good. So just one more point, which all of you know, but I just wanted to remind you that whenever a planet, the new era that we're entering, the new age we are entering, began at the end of 2020. The stasis we felt with the lockdowns and the pandemic and the sudden hyper control that everybody experienced, we now know, looking back, that the world has not been the same since that time. So Jupiter conjuncted Saturn on December 22nd, 2020 at 0 degrees, 29 minutes Aquarius. And this, every time a planet hits 0 degrees now, this year, when Neptune on March 31st gets to 0 degrees, or Saturn in May, and Uranus on July 27th, each time a planet gets to 0 degrees, it's awakening this air age, this great mutation that began in 2020. Now here we are, July 7th, 2025. And let's have a look. So we again have Saturn, Uranus, but this time we have a sextile. but this cycle, which really is about what is the nature, what is the structure of the world we belong to. In the Civil War, they were in a square. In the War of Independence, they were trine. In World War II, they were conjunct. And here there's a sextile, a really tight sextile, but with who? With Venus. And Saturn is with Neptune. And I see this chart. We see the minor grand trine, the trine between Pluto and Uranus, bisected by Saturn and Neptune. So many cycles of the past century, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction was in the 60s, as we all know, as our brilliant colleague Rick Tarnas has documented in the most extraordinary ways. But we're coming into the trine of that time, and we're coming into a vision of the world, as Colin said, a new vision, building something, incarnating a new vision. Now, I do have to say that the Saturn-Neptune often asks for a sacrifice of some kind so that the new can be born. One of the questions of this time is there some group in our society that will be singled out for sacrifice? Are there people who will be scapegoated? During the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the 50s, we had the anti-communist hysteria of McCarthy and the McCarthy hearings that blacklisted artists and writers and filmmakers and destroyed careers because they were suspected of or tarred with the brush or jailed for communist activities and sympathies. So one of the things that is important here is that we are called to act for what is true and what will bring freedom, not just to ourselves, but to all of us. And that, for me, is the real power. I'm not going to talk about Salem, but I think I should end there, right, Celeste? I think that's the real power of Uranus and Gemini.
Lynn, that was phenomenal. I have a question for you. When I was looking at Salem. I have been
Yeah, that's
thinking,
okay. We can look at it. Look, Salem witch trial, Uranus in Gemini, opposition Saturn, exact. Now, this is not the trial. This is the beginning of the events where young adolescent girls began to act weirdly, manifest symptoms, and then disappear, disobey their minister parents. And then they said, oh, we've been hexed. And so these witch trials began to happen. It was a form of mass hysteria that led to the deaths and imprisonment of many people. But that after the events of Salem, there was no longer any witch trial ever in the United States, in the American colonies. It was finished.
I've been wondering, Neptune and Aries could be like conjunct Saturn, burning witches at the stake. There's been this surfacing of witches, demonic possession, this sort of thing in the collective.
The old women with cat ladies, unmarried women with cat ladies, that's a witch archetype. A certain former Fox News presenter who had bite marks on his neck from a demon attack.
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think these things, this is part of, I mean, here you can see that Neptune was in Pisces. So I think we're lucky Neptune is leaving Pisces, actually. But during this time, they used supernatural evidence in these trials. And they only ended when the governor's wife was accused by the girls of being a witch. And so many people were in jail that the public opinion turned against them, and they outlawed the use of what's called spectral evidence in the United States after the Salem witch trials. And at the same time this was going on, the whole system of what's called the Age of Enlightenment in Europe was coming into power on the other side of the Atlantic. So I don't know if there are questions.
Yes,
So,
let me see here on the questions.
and you know, I mean,
There's a question here. What was the astrological correspondence of the 1950s? I'm not sure what that.
Saturn conjunct Neptune in around 2020 to 23 Libra was in 1952 and 1953.
Okay.
And it was square Uranus, by the way, in Cancer.
Okay. And what do you have anything to say about the fixed star Aldebaran and its connection with Uranus in the USA chart?
No, not today. I mean, maybe another time, but who's ever asking the question can do the research on that.
Yeah. And another thing I found interesting with this Salem. So what is the time for this event? This is my question. The Salem witch
Okay,
event.
here's the date. This is the beginning. I mean, this was really, there's really a lot of information on these trials. So the 29th of November, 1691, okay, is the first manifestations of what you would call the hysteria. And in fact, there's a story that the daughter of the minister, she'd been playing with a mirror, they've been burning candles, you know, doing like early adolescent games to see who their future husbands would be, right? And these girls are like 10. They've just gotten their 9 or 10, 11. They've just gotten their periods. They're you know, they're in adolescent deregulation, and rather than being rather than saying, oh, sorry, I disobeyed you, they blamed it on. They had fainting fits, they said they were being choked, they started screaming, and it was like a form of hysteria that spread through the entire settlement, but only affected young girls. But 22 people were hanged, many of them women. The first one, a woman of color, a Black servant named Tabitha. Really very serious form of mass hysteria. So Uranus and Gemini, there's a moment where basically the community wakes up and says, no, this can't be right. We're just going to put an end to this. And they come in, they redo the trials, they free everybody from prison, and they let them go. And at the same time, you have someone like John Locke publishing a book on what education should be like, where he's saying that basically you shouldn't beat, whip, and punish children to help them learn, but that you should open their minds. At the same time, a counterforce is also rising in the world. And one of the things that's important with Uranus and Gemini is there can be both going on simultaneously.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you, Lynn. That was amazing. You answered all of the questions. Let's have everyone come back, Colin and Bill, for a moment before we sign off. There's one question. Okay, here, Bill. Can you talk about your newsletter, please? Do you want to give any highlights on what people get for signing with your newsletter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do for the public every month. I write Cycles Research, which covers the stock market, the gold market, and the bond market, and has a recommended portfolio of stocks. And I love the newsletter business because you can write it from everywhere, from anywhere, and that's it. But I rarely. Sometimes I mention. People ask me, "Would you mention the planetary cycles?" Occasionally, I mention them, but all the research I've ever seen about newsletters, people are not interested in the nuts and bolts of how you did it. They're just interested in the results, what you project. So, but the cycles you saw, that was directly from my 2025 forecast that I sent to institutions. So it doesn't, differ very much.
Yeah. And another question was about with the upcoming this discussion of tariffs and expelling all these undocumented workers from the US or putting in camps. Do you have anything to say about how that may impact your predictions or
I haven't, it's not going to
or
impact my
no?
predictions. I want to look at it, Eisenhower did expel all the Mexicans during the 50s. So we have a previous event to look, I want to look back at that previous event. But I have nothing to say about it right now.
Okay. Well, great. I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much for all your wisdom, the comments.
Yeah,
Everyone loves all of the
all
talks.
great. Great to hear both of you. Really wonderful.
Likewise, Lynn, happy full moon in Gemini to you.
Nice to hear from you too.
What is your sun sign, Bill?
What?
What is your sun sign?
I am Taurus with Capricorn rising.
Oh, okay, so we have two Geminis and a Taurus. I love it.
Who works
Wonderful.
in the economy? I mean, is astrology real? It's just, it's so on the nose. I can't love it anymore.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's
Well,
great.
well, thank you so much. Everyone who joined, thank you for your wonderful participation. And you'll get the recording in a couple of days. And yeah, have a wonderful holiday season. And OPA will be back in January for Transit
Great.
Talk the first Sunday of the month.
And thank you, Celeste, for all your hard work and
Yeah.
your great spirit and optimism in putting all of these together. Really a wonderful job.
Oh, thank you so
Excellent
much.
speaking voice for a hostess. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm a Taurus too.
Okay. Two Tauruses from New Jersey.
Yes.
Have a beautiful day, everyone. And
Bye, everybody.
take good care.
Bye.